Now, welcome back. For those joining us live, we are meeting today to continue our consideration of the subject matter of Bill C-70, an act respecting countering foreign interference. We now continue with our fifth and final panel for today. I'd like to welcome du Comité des parlementaires sur la sécurité nationale et le renseignement.
From the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, Mr. McGuinty, Chair of the Committee, Honorable Francis Lankin, Senator and Member of the Committee, Mr. Alex Ruff, Member for Bruce Gray Owen Sound and Member of the Committee. They are accompanied by Ms. Lisa Marie Iman, Executive Director of the Committee Secretariat. I want to welcome you all. I will now call on you to make your opening remarks, and we will start with Honorable David McGuinty. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much, Chair.
Chair and honourable members of the committee, for your invitation to appear this evening as you examine Bill C-70. It's my pleasure to discuss the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians' perspective on this proposed legislation in light of the release of its most recent special report on foreign interference in Canada's democratic processes and institutions. This report is yet another example of a unanimous, nonpartisan review of the government's response to a national security threat by a committee of security-cleared senators and members of Parliament from all major parties and groups, which is why I'm joined and honoured to be joined this evening by your colleague and my colleague, the Honourable Francis Lankin, and of course Alex Ruff, Member of Parliament for Bruce Gray Owen Sound. Lisa Marie Inman is also with us here this evening. She's Executive Director of the Outstanding Secretary to the Committee, and she is also available to assist if required. Senators, we will be restricting our comments to the matter at hand this evening. Nous sommes ici plus précisément.
We are here specifically to help you understand the reasoning that underlie the unanimous conclusions and recommendations of the committee when it comes to some proposals in Bill C-70. Our committee enjoys a unique position to be able to help you in that regard. First of all, we can say that we have developed some expertise while studying this topic because it's the third time that the committee is looking into the government's response to the threat posed by foreign interference in Canada. The committee delved into foreign interference for the first time as part of its special report in 2018 on the official visit of the Prime Minister in India. As for the 2019 report, that was a more in-depth study of foreign interference activities from 2015 to 2018. The last study is based on those two reports.
Members have access to highly classified information that cannot be discussed in public. In other words, we have reviewed the intelligence reporting that points toward the need for this legislation. As such, we appear before you today not as policymakers, but as a committee with privileged insight into why the need for legislative reform is so critical and so pressing. That said, NSICOP, as a reminder, is a review body. There may be questions we cannot answer this evening given our mandate and our security requirements. As with its 2019 review, the committee found that foreign interference in democratic processes and institutions is a sophisticated and a pervasive national security threat that undermines Canadians' democratic rights and the integrity and credibility of the parliamentary process. Interference activities in democratic processes and institutions, we write, targeted all orders of government, political staff, civil society groups, ethno-cultural communities, community organizations, business persons, and journalists. In particular, the committee found that Canada's legal framework does not enable security agencies and law enforcement to effectively respond to this threat. In other words, we have consistently noted that there is a lack of robust tools to address foreign interference. This contributes to a situation in which there are few meaningful deterrents to foreign states and their Canada-based proxies to conduct interference activities. This makes Canada vulnerable. For this reason, the committee's first major recommendation of relevance to C-70 was that the government address several specific legislative gaps before the next federal election and in 5 key areas. First, the committee recommended the creation of a Foreign Influence Transparency Registry. Crafted carefully to avoid the stigmatization of ethnocultural communities and to protect Canadian rights and freedoms, the legislation should clarify what behaviors qualify as interference. It would serve both as a deterrent to agents of foreign states and would provide the RCMP with offenses to investigate. Similar legislation in allied states like Australia and the United States has proven to be a useful tool for police to respond to foreign interference. A Foreign Influence Transparency Registry would also support transparency, much like the current registry of lobbyists. Second, Canada's criminal law does not define or criminalize foreign interference. The committee recommended amendments to the Criminal Code and the Security of Information Act to actually do so. A key challenge for the security and intelligence community identified by the committee was the absence of an agreed-upon threshold for action. A clear and modern definition of foreign interference would help to clarify what activities do and do not qualify as a threat. That should ensure that departments develop standardized definitions of what constitutes a threshold for action. Third, the CSIS Act is clearly and invariably showing its age. Of note, the Act does not currently allow CSIS to provide classified information to parliamentarians or other orders of government. This makes it difficult to properly brief and warn parliamentarians and other orders of government. Difficulties also extend to sharing information with investigators who are not peace officers, such as electoral officers, to enable investigations, lay charges, or support prosecutions. For this reason, the committee recommends modernizing the CSIS Act to facilitate the wider sharing of classified information, which is actually included in this present bill. Quatrièmement,
Fourth, the committee recommends that the government resolve difficulties associated with converting intelligence into evidence. Intelligence agencies carefully protect their sensitive collection techniques, their confidential sources, and intelligence passed on by allies. The committee noted several instances during its review where intelligence agencies withheld information from law enforcement agencies, including the RCMP and the Office of the Commissioner of Federal Elections in Canada, for fear that the information will be disclosed to the court. According to the committee, this is a very serious problem. We are encouraging the government to continue looking into all the other legislative options to fully resolve the issue.
the committee reviewed troubling intelligence suggesting that nomination processes and leadership races are particularly vulnerable to foreign interference. This is a critical gap because a number of electoral districts in Canada are considered safe seats for one party or another. And because the number of votes required to sway riding nominations is often small, they are a very useful avenue for foreign states to engineer the election of their preferred candidate. While the Canada Elections Act imposes administrative penalties on fundraising by a foreign entity, Canada does not criminalize interfering in nominations or in any other political party process. For this reason, the committee recommends that the government reduce vulnerabilities in political nomination contests and leadership races. We're encouraged by the new influencing political or governmental processes found in this bill. A second major recommendation of relevance to C70, the government should also engage all political parties to determine whether party nomination processes should be included within the framework of the Canada Elections Act. This would mean party nomination processes would be subject to monitoring by Elections Canada and the Office of the Commissioner for Canada Elections. The committee also called for the government to work with Parliament to determine whether the mandate of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner and the Senate Ethics Officer could be revised to include concerns regarding foreign interference. Currently, foreign interference is not defined in the Conflict of Interest Act or in the Conflict of Interest Code of either chamber. As such, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner and the Senate Ethics Officer are not currently expressly empowered to investigate conflicts of interest linked or potentially linked to foreign interference. In its third major recommendation of relevance to C70, the committee called on the government to review and renew national security legislation, strategies, and funding to ensure these actually keep pace with the evolution of the threat. And, colleagues, it is evolving. This is to ensure the security and intelligence community has the tools and the resources it needs to respond to the threat in a way that discourages future interference efforts. This and future governments must also regularly include parliamentary review provisions in legislations. These statutory reviews are critical for identifying how Canada keeps pace with the threat. We're pleased to see the 5-year review provision included in the CSIS Act amendments. The government also needs to respect the review provisions set out in legislation, and here the members of the committee and NSICOP are clear. We are including the review of NSICOP's own enabling legislation in this regard. Letting them slip past their deadlines does not convey the impression that Canada takes its national security legislative framework seriously. All in all, Bill C70, from the perspective of the committee, is a good start. And in closing, I wish to say that all of our reports are the result of the dedicated work of my colleagues on the committee and the outstanding staff at the executive who backstop that work. Since its inception, every single finding and recommendation in all 13 NSICOP reviews have been made entirely on a consensual basis between all members. This is due to all of our steadfast commitment to treating national security and intelligence as something that transcends the partisan arena, and we treat all of these in a very nonpartisan way. On that note, we look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. McGuinty. Now we proceed to questions. I remind you that 4 minutes will be allotted for each question, including the answer. I ask that you keep your questions succinct in an effort to allow as many interventions as possible. Et nous allons commencer avec le sénateur.
We shall start with Senator Beam, followed by Senator Kutcher.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. McGuinty and fellow members of NSICOP and Madame Inman for obviously the very good report that you have produced. Mr. McGuinty, in your remarks, you mentioned other jurisdictions, and I'd like to pursue that a little bit with you, especially those that are in our own sort of Westminster tradition. The Australians have had a registry since 2018. There has been legislation passed in the UK as well. How have you, and you touch on it a little bit, but this is all very new for us in Canada, including how to deal with the question of cabinet confidentiality. And I appreciate there are things that you can't tell us, and my top secret security clearance ran out a few years ago. But it's a difficult issue, and it's one that I would just like to put out there. That's one. And then the second one is there anything that would impede, in your view, looking forward to provide briefings and onboardings for new parliamentarians, whether in this place or the other, as they are elected or as they are appointed? That does not necessarily have to be classified, could be unclassified, but could set out the rules of the road, as noted in your report, for example, as to what are the roles of diplomats that are accredited here, how you should engage with them, that sort of thing. So it's a two-pronged question, please.
Thank you for the question, Senator. We didn't set out entirely in this journey to bring a comparative perspective in terms of what Five Eye partners or Westminster-style countries might be, how they may be ordering their affairs. We did find in a number of occasions that the UK and Australia were perhaps further ahead than we were in dealing with some of these things. I alluded to the fact that there are criminal sanctions, for example, in both of those jurisdictions if you interfere with nomination processes. But it is important for us and important for you who will be looking at C70 and improving it to draw on that experience comparatively. As a general proposition, I think a committee would probably take a little bit exception with the notion that this is new to Canada. What we found is this is not new to Canada, that in fact Canada's been aware of this for decades, and that it is time now, we feel, at the committee to move with relative haste to catch up to other jurisdictions. And with respect specifically to the question of briefing parliamentarians, we've been raising the notion of briefing parliamentarians now for 5 years. And the review repeats that we have taken it to the Prime Minister and to the centre of the government several times. We've been asking for parliamentarians to be briefed immediately upon being sworn in and regularly thereafter, in order for them to understand what foreign interference is. Foreign interference is not foreign influence, for example, right? There are covert and other implications with respect to foreign interference. What's a co-optee, right? What is a representative or somebody representing a malign state actor on Canadian soil? How do you protect yourself? What questions might you ask? What about your staff? Now, all that being said, one of the points we do want to make early on through this appearance this evening is this. There is, of course, a rightful focus on Parliament and parliamentarians. But it's extremely important for you all to understand that this review transcends just Parliament, and not just Parliament at the federal level, but provincial and municipal governments. This is a societal problem and challenge. And we have seen information which has led us to write about the situation in the media business, in our community associations, in our boardrooms, right? This is something which is omnipresent in Canada now. But with respect to parliamentarians, absolutely. We go back at it again in this review, calling on the government to brief parliamentarians. We note that the Minister of Public Safety is taking some steps in this regard. But if this was combined, briefing was combined with new ethical provisions in the House and the Senate level, that would go some distance in all parliamentarians, Senate and otherwise, Senate in both houses, to be fully aware of the risks.
Can I add something?
Please.
Thank you. If I may just add that, of course, both chambers control their own processes around these things. I have asked since the 2018 report on foreign interference for appropriate briefings of all new senators through Senate Security, and I have raised the issue with the Black Rod to raise it on my behalf. If any of you are on CEBA, I would ask you please to consider raising it there, because these briefings, and not just by our own security protective services, by CSIS and other agencies, I think is critical to senators and, in general, parliamentarians being able to do their work with their eyes wide open.
I would add staff to that as well. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Sénateur Couture, suivi du sénateur.
Senator Couture, followed by Senator Youssef.
For being here and for the excellent work that you are doing, not just this last report, but all the work you've done, and reminding us about the propensity for Canadians not being fully aware of the activities of malevolent state actors and their ability to cause harm. This is not the Guzenko affair all over again, but it bears the same concerns. In your last two reports, you made numerous recommendations that could have been addressed in this bill, and Mr. McGuinty, you did comment on about a couple of them. which of those NSICOP recommendations that could have been added to C70 have not been added to C70 that you think should be added to C70? That's the first question. And then the second question is, in your report, you spend quite a bit of time raising concerns about the fact that the RCMP doesn't have the capacity to address many of the emerging threat environments. And if you could say more about what would be necessary there.
Yeah, you'll forgive me, I can't remember exactly what we said about the RCMP in this review. I know what we said in the last review we did on the federal policing mandate of the RCMP, where we pointed out the hundreds and hundreds of officers that are lacking now to deal with the federal policing mandate challenges that the RCMP is struggling with. And I think we saw a bit more from the Auditor General last week as well on that front. Look, there are two suites of things I think that we have to decouple in terms of what we said about in the review that apply to C70. The first are actual legislative recommendations. The majority of what we've put forward here in terms of legislative calls for action find themselves in C70, almost entirely or partly there. And then there are a series of recommendations that are not legislative in nature, and not specifically. And so the ones that are specifically legislative, what we would call recommendation 1 in our review, I think is 4 or 5 bullet points, we find that most of those are captured. But we would say this. We recommended the government define foreign interference in Canadian law to ensure a common understanding of what the threat actually looks like. This was not included in Bill C70. That would be very important because at this stage we can't seem to find a foreign interference definition that transcends all different actors. For example, if you were to ask the police chief in Halifax what foreign interference was, you would be hard-pressed to get a clear answer. If you were to ask one department over another, one official over another, what foreign interference really looked like, they would probably take you to a CSIS definition, but you would probably find some confusion and understanding. So there's one area where we thought that it would be important. So that modern definition would be very important to migrate into Bill C70. Some of the others that are not legislative in nature haven't found a way into the bill. That's some of the things I talked about, like the ethics, the role of the ethics commissioner, right? We think that's pretty important. You know, every year, I'm not sure about the Senate, but members of Parliament have to fill in about a 20-page summary of disclosure documents. And I went through it again painfully a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't see a single reference to foreign interference.
Yeah.
I wasn't asked to attest to any overt efforts to cultivate a relationship with me. I wasn't asked anything. I didn't have any place to disclose any concerns. And I dare say if I picked up the phone and called one of the officers at the office of the Ethics Commissioner's office to say, hey, I think I have a foreign interference concern. Can you help me? I don't think we're going to get any information that would be helpful. So those are some of the things that we called for that didn't find their way into the bill. Am I missing something?
Yep.
Yes? What is things? Go for it.
So if you ask what's not in there, I'm just going to refer to our recommendations. Recommendation 1 is the legislative actions, and as the chair indicated, we still require a definition of foreign interference. The engagement of political parties to look at the nomination process and determine whether or not the political parties are in agreement that it should come under Canada elections. And that's a process that can be begun by any political party, but all of them need to be participants in that. This chair just mentioned the ethics commissioners in both chambers. Some of the things are not legislative, so ensuring that the roles, mandates, and accountabilities of the National Security Council and supporting governance mandate structures, that's something that has been started to be addressed. There continues to be work there, at least from the review period that we looked at. I can only speak from what's in our review. And then, you know, some things are just a matter of calling on government to do it, that they immediately implement and report annually on briefings for parliamentarians and the threat of foreign interference. It's just an accountability mechanism. So those things aren't in the bill, but they're not appropriately centered within a legislative response.
The foreign interference definition you would recommend. Okay.
Sorry, Senator, could you repeat that? I'm getting older. I'm
My
getting older.
understanding is that you would actually recommend definition of foreign interference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you want to pick up on that, Alex?
I just wanted to go a little bit more on your question about what the RCMP or police of jurisdiction are lacking. And this gets to the crux of the challenge, and we lay it out in the report in paragraph 153, talking about the sensitive intelligence and evidence conundrum. And, you know, how do you protect our sources or techniques that the security apparatus, you know, utilizes, our relationships with our foreign partners and our allies, if that's where some of this information is coming from. And ultimately, you know, and I would remind all parliamentarians, but all, you know, anybody that's impacted, you know, we conclude sort of in paragraph 164, you know, some of these actions, obviously, that we're reporting on may be illegal, but they're unlikely to lead to criminal charges owing to Canada's failure to address the longstanding issue of protecting classified information and methods in the judicial processes. So Bill C-70 tackles that first part about how do you share the information. I don't believe my understanding of the bill in its current form tackles how do you deal with that second aspect, that even if that information now gets to our law enforcement, whether or not it's going to be able to do that. So that's something I encourage this committee and all committees studying the bill to continue to look into.
Senator Youssef, suivi du...
Senator Yusuf, followed by Senator Yusakos.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you for all of your hard work. But, sir, let me come back to you. I'll use your own quote. It's a good start, not exactly a resounding cheer of direction where we're going, and I appreciate, you know, your cautionary advice to us. Given the diversity of our country, and we wouldn't have expected this, but this is a reality today. The diverse community in our country are now subject to foreign intimidation to a large extent, and of course, to the context in which we examine this in a way without perpetuating racism or stereotypes about these communities, do you think there's a deep appreciation how we need to address this in a way that give confidence to these communities, but equally to the security apparatus and how they go about doing their job doesn't create more harm and at the same time protecting the country's security as we go forward?
That's an incredibly important question, and one that we struggled with, and one that we looked at very closely, which is why on page 13 of the English version of the review, there is a separate box that discusses in detail the notion of transnational repression, because we found it warranted individual treatment. And in it, we try to define what it is, how is it performed. We use a couple of cases to talk about the exertion of control of an ethnocultural community. We also wanted to debunk some commentary. For example, we did work directly on the question of what are called police stations in a number of urban centres in Canada. We defined that for Canadians. They have a better idea of what they are, what they're not, what they seem to be all about, what do they do, where are they located, what does CSIS assess they do, what did the United States do about so-called police stations, what is the RCMP doing about them now. But this question of getting this balance right is extraordinarily important. And one of the, not anomalies, one of the benefits of a Canadian context for this balance, Senator, which goes back to something Senator Beam mentioned, raised a minute ago comparatively, Canada has a Charter of Rights. Other jurisdictions don't. And so when we look for bespoke legislation, custom-tailored legislation for the Canadian context, it's maybe a smaller needle to thread, because we have cherished a Charter of Rights, freedoms, and protections that we all want to see upheld. So this question of transnational repression is a new normal. It is here. It's arrived. We've seen it. We've defined it. And it's something we hope C-70 will be able to also reflect in whatever changes we make in dealing with foreign interference.
If I may, you found, I guess, something quite unique in the context of our parliamentary system. We're talking about national security. We should concern every one of us who are in the parliamentary system, whether it's in the House or in the Senate. Yet, for a variety of reasons, we can't seem to come to a common consensus. This should not be a political issue, either in the House or in the Senate, how we approach it, but morally how we collectively work to ensure we're doing our best to ensure the security of the country is paramount in the work we do as parliamentarians. So how do we overcome that based on your experience working with your committee, where you seems to have a consensus every time you put together a report? What would you share with this committee so we can learn? Because I think at the end of the day, in my view, other jurisdictions seems to have done this in a very interesting way, but yet we are still struggling to get from base 1 to base 2 in how we can work better as parliamentarians to achieve this common objective for the greater good of the country.
I think what allows us at our committee to be able to work this way is what I would define as nobility of purpose. There are just some things that transcend partisanship. I think the committee would obviously agree that national security is one of those things. We might even also agree that climate change was another. Certainly that's my view. Some things that ought to be removed from that partisan arena. I think good faith and goodwill can go a long way in deliberations that are multi-party, but also that are driven towards the good. I think there is a consensus now at the parliamentary level, and perhaps even at other orders of government level, and we highlight those in the review as well, that something better has to emerge from this process. Canadians are watching. They're very concerned. And, you know, one of the things that we do at the committee is we feel we have an outreach and educative role to expose Canadians to some of the challenges. But we're very encouraged at the same time with C-70. We spent a lot of time in this review highlighting what the government has done in the review period. We're also very, very clear about our assessment of what they've done. But there have been steps taken. You know, bodies like NSICOP have been created, like NCIRA, like the Critical Elections Protocol, which didn't exist 7 years ago. Like the SITE task force, which didn't exist, and other measures that are moving forward, but there is room for improvement. And I would say that, I don't know, I'm always remembered of the old maxim from negotiation when your negotiator comes to you and says, I just can't get any more. We're at the end of the rope. We just can't make any more progress. And I know I'm talking to someone who knows a little bit about negotiation. You know, the golden rule in negotiation, when your chief negotiator tells you that, is simple. You change negotiators and start again until you get it right. So I think my colleague Alex Ruff can also add to that, but and well, maybe both colleagues, Alex.
So just quickly, your answer is how do we up our game on this as parliamentarians? Recommendation 6, immediately start the briefings and annually report on it so we know who's been briefed and who hasn't been briefed, and if you haven't bothered getting briefed, it's a way to hold people to accountable. And the second thing, every single parliamentarian, and in fact I would encourage every single Canadian, read this report from start to finish, maybe read it once every year, because there's something in there that I think gets the message across. So I think that's, you know, the value, you know, it's not about us that helped author it. It's the fact is this is an issue. It needs to be resolved, and you want to tone down the partisanship and up our game on national security intelligence. We all got to do a better job of educating ourselves on what the threats are, what the vulnerabilities are, and how do we deal with it going forward.
Suivi de la sénatrice Patterson. Quickly? Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you. Very quickly, it's something that, you know, that saying you lay awake at night thinking about. I agree with everything that Alex said. What I would add to it is I understand in the first blush reporting of this report and its contents, a bit of a shock value that has taken place. And the response has primarily been thus far from inside both chambers of parliament, a focus on parliamentarians. Who, what, when, where. I really need us as parliamentarians to look broader in our responsibility to Canadians. These are academics that are being interfered with, research projects, corporation decisions, community organizations, ethnocultural communities, the media themselves who haven't reported on the fact that they also are subject to foreign interference. These bigger issues should be a uniting force for all of us to get outside of the inside baseball that's been going on in the last week. I say with respect, and I understand it, but there's a broader horizon here. Let's lift our eyes up and let's get focused on how this is touching every part of Canadian society, and we need to get ahead of it.
Merci. Sénateur Roussaka, suivi de la sénatrice.
Thank you, Senator Housakos, followed by Senator Patterson and Senator Zickens.
Thanks for being with us today. The truth of the matter is Parliament has failed Canadians, and thus far what we've heard from witnesses, we have failed Canadians on all sides here. The truth of the matter is while our Five Eyes allies around the world have passed legislation years ago, have put into place mechanisms and given tools to their law enforcement to deal with this, and in many instances our Five Eye allies have charged people. There's people before the courts. There's people in jail. Here in Canada, we're having discussions about what the definition of foreign interference is. That's a problem. And yes, this is a good bill and it's a good step forward, but the truth of the matter is there was something called Bill C-51 in 2015, the National Security Act that was passed. The first thing that the current government did was C-59, was repeal it and revamp it, take teeth away from it. We've had MPs calling for legislation as far back as 2019 for a similar Foreign Registry Act. We dragged our feet. There's a bill in the Senate, S-237, that's been sitting there adjourned for 3 years, very similar to C-70. None of my colleagues around the table wanted to speak to it. So these are serious concerns and questions, and you're right, Senator Lankin, this isn't a partisan issue, but we have done nothing in order to address a very serious issue. And the question is, why has it taken so long? And why is it that we're allowing in our country all roads in terms of national security to lead to the Prime Minister's office, and he decides what is made public and what isn't, and he decides when it is? NSICOP is a parliamentary body that is shrouded with secrecy at every step. And the answer always is, we're dealing with sensitive national security issues. But you know what Canadians want to know? How are we dealing with them? And where is the accountability? So when our colleagues are being named, they're being named not because of anything we did in Parliament. It's because some public servants at CSIS got tired of the inertia and they leaked this information. It's the only reason we're having this debate. So the question I have because you've been dealing with this, what do we need to change in our parliamentary structure so we can have more transparency, more accountability?
Thank you, Senator. A couple of things. The committee was very clear in calling out the government for a slow reaction to a lot of these issues. Paragraph 175, the slow response to a known threat was a serious failure, and one from which Canada may feel the consequences for years to come. Those are, like every word and sentence and paragraph in this review, those are deliberately chosen words. We talk about the need to act now. We talk about the need to act swiftly. We talk about delays. We talk about the government being slow to do so in terms of different delays. It's important for Canadians maybe to come up to speed, and even parliamentarians to start, to come up to speed more with the notion of classified information, intelligence, how it doesn't always amount to evidence. There's truth to that. This conundrum of moving intelligence into the light of day in criminal justice proceedings, not easy. And as I said earlier, this is something, and I'm not here as an apologist for any government. Mark my words, I'm just not. We are not here for that purpose. But I remember 20 years ago when I was first elected, the discussion about creating an NSICOP-like structure. First it was Mr. Easter, then it was Mr. Martin, then it was Joyce Murray, my colleague, and finally it was Mr. Trudeau, who in third-party status said we need some kind of mechanism like NSICOP to be able to deal with this. And I remember going to Prime Minister Harper and asking him if he would not consider, and at that time he was not open to it at that stage. Perhaps he would be today. I suspect he would be. And I don't think it's a question of blame here. I think it's a question of all of us coming together now to act quickly and swiftly. And C-70 is a wonderful first start. It's capable of improvement, counting on you good folks to make it better. That would be my first and initial reaction to the timing. Now, just a clarification for the record in terms of, I think you alluded to the question of redactions. I want to just break it to everybody. The Prime Minister doesn't sit at a table with a black marker and stroke off parts of the review. This is all conducted very technically through four very established clear criteria in the law that creates NSICOP. Government can only redact for certain purposes. It is predicated on Section 38 of the Canada Evidence Act, and our teams of experts in the federal government who do this. So we've been through this 13 separate times, so we have a good idea of how it works. And it is it's predicated on removing material that would be deemed to be injurious, but on 4 specific grounds. So it's not something that is random or that is simply politicized. I think we can tell you, certainly Francis Lincoln and I can tell you, having been at NSICOP since the beginning, we can't remember an instance where the government has tried to, in any way, shape, or form, politicize the work. It's certainly the written review work of the committee. Francis?
Yeah, I think it is important for us all to keep that in mind, because there are a lot of assertions and allegations that are being made about this that inadvertently mislead the public about what the process is. The things that are redacted on the grounds that are in legislation. And the services in the security and intelligence community, the committees, whether it be NCIRA or NSICOP, are bound by those provisions. And I think people have mentioned a lot, and Senator Housakos, in your comments, you talked about lack of prosecutions. And the real challenge, and sometimes people roll their eyes a little bit, but the intelligence to evidence challenge is a real one, and it's different than in other countries. We certainly live with, and I think most of us cherish, a Charter of Rights and Freedoms which protect individual citizens. And its interaction with courts of law and how evidence is disclosed to accused, et cetera, are all important aspects of this. And not betraying sources, tradecraft, are important concepts for us to understand as with respect to what's injurious to our country's interests. So I appreciate, and before coming to this chamber, I was on the Security Intelligence Review Committee, the predecessor to NCIRA, and we raised a number of these issues at that time. So this is a long time coming, but you know, when things arrive, sometimes there's a moment and an opportunity. So now, that's why I make the plea to step up and above and find a way to move this forward. And it's not just about moving it quickly and urgently. These things are all urgent. It is about doing the work to review and understand, and does this bill get it right? The chair has alluded to this, but as a review body, we are not, like our legislative or our committee counterparts in Australia, a legislative committee that reviews legislation. We'll make recommendations, but it's up to government and Parliament to determine if the provisions as set out in any proposed bill are appropriate or going to do the job.
If I could, Senator Housakos, I want to come back to the question of leaks. You are right, and we have stipulated clearly in paragraphs 165 and 166 that it is, first of all, we decry completely the notion of leaks. This is not whistleblowing. This is an illegal act. You're not a patriot. You're not a whistleblower. You're actually contravening the law. And we talk about that very clearly, but we also say that we acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. I'm going to read it. Prior to the leaks, there was little sense of urgency between elected officials and senior decision makers to address outstanding gaps to this important and well-documented threat to national security. The leaks were the principal catalyst. That's unfortunate, but here we are. And so what we're saying now is we're here. This has been out. We don't believe in leaks. We think it's actually quite dangerous for our security and intelligence apparatus and the folks who work there. But you are right in stipulating that this has been something that has catalyzed action. It's unfortunate.
Patterson, suivi de la sénatrice Deacon.
Senator Patterson, followed by Senator Deacon and Senator Carrion.
Chair, so thank you very much for this report. I do believe it is absolutely critical for Canadians to have it available to them. And Senator Lankin, I agree with you that we need to focus beyond parliamentarians and the processes of Parliament. But we cannot forget that one of the objectives of foreign interference is to undermine confidence in democracies, to implant their wishes in places where democracies don't wish to have them. So I'm going to come back to your comments about holding people accountable within the parliamentary world, within parliamentarians, and even within the Senate under Section 48.4 of the Ethics and Conflict of Interest Code for Senators. The Senate ethics officers can, and I'm going to quote this again, in carrying out an inquiry, the Senate ethics officers has the power to send for persons, papers, and records which powers may be enforced by the Senate acting on the recommendation of the committee following a request from the Senate ethics officers. I do believe that Canadians want to know, want to have some process shared that people are going to at least be looked into if you have made allegations of parliamentarians involved in these activities. So my question to you, really for both houses, is there a way for Senate ethics or House of Commons ethics to request a copy of the report to quietly and look at the behavior of certain senators or parliamentarians, should this in fact be true, without exposing them to the public?
I could weigh in, but Chair, do you want to take the first response to that?
I thought you were going to say that question's so easy, even the chair could answer it. That's a very difficult question. We're not at NSICOP seized with the question of really the responsibility of the dissemination of the information. What backstops the review. We're not the owners of the intelligence. We are not the collectors nor the assessors of that intelligence. So that's a question I think better put to the government as to whether or not they're in a position to share. I guess you're implying the unredacted version of the report, I think.
That could be the potential, but I would suggest that your committee is the owner of the report.
Yeah, now I'm really going to turn to the smart person and ask Lisa Marie Inman to answer so she could tell us a bit more about that.
So I think that you're right in terms of it is a question that's typically directed to the government. So the committee produces the report, but the committee submits its reports to the Prime Minister and to the concerned ministers per our Act. So, sorry.
And so then I would follow up. Has the committee recommended to the government that there should be follow-up of some type of this? Because we have mentioned, both in your report, in the publicity has come out, we've talked amongst ourselves, is it may not be a criminal act, but, and we are self-regulating and needs to be looked at. So has a recommendation come from the committee that the government should be sharing this in a confidential fashion with the appropriate ethics groups?
The report, and in particular recommendation 2, let me just read that part of it out. So we call on the government to engage political parties, so they must be involved as well, and we need to talk about both chambers. With respect to, I've already mentioned nominations, Canada Elections Act, and to work with Parliament to determine whether the statute governing the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner in the Senate Ethics Office be revised to include foreign interference. That's an important precursor to having the ethics officers in either chamber take action with respect to complaints that may come forward on this basis, to be able to determine what access they might have to information. You can see that there are efforts in this bill to allow CSIS to share more information. But I also come back to the point that the chair made and that I believe MP Ruff referred to as well in terms of the responsibilities of parliamentarians. And you can't be responsible if you haven't been told. So the briefings of parliamentarians upon arrival and on an ongoing regular basis is the wake-up call that all of our colleagues, I think, will appreciate with respect to understanding if somebody approaches you. Should I be suspicious of this? There have been lots of comments about the words witting and unwitting. we need to be witting, and we can only be witting if we have been briefed and informed, and I think it's a critical first step, and I think it very much relates, Senator Patterson, to your question about the ethics officers and the committees that serve them.
Senatrice Deacon.
Senator Deacon, followed by Senator Carignan and Senator Cardozo.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for this report, but all your reports. They're outstanding whenever we get them, and always what's interesting to see is the conversion to action. I like thinking about the FIDA and what its intent is, and one thing it will do is create a list of entities and individuals that law enforcement will have to monitor, maintain, and enforce. Our earlier witnesses today expressed concerns about resources, needed to do this right, needed to do it well. In our sanctions study that we did over in Foreign Affairs, it was widely said that the sanctions regime was compliance-based. To quote witnesses. There have been so few prosecutions that as a practical matter, the regime depends on entities and individuals being aware of their obligations and acting accordingly. That's what was said during our conversation. When I look at FIDA, I worry that we might go down the same road and not allocate the required resources to see it enforced right and well. Is it your understanding that this list will be compliance-based? And if so, how effective do you think that will be?
Is it acceptable to say I have no idea?
Sure.
I have no idea. This is not an issue that the committee explored or looked at carefully, but we're certainly going to take careful note of it. I don't think we can help. I'm trying to find in my mind in the 98 pages whether we bore down on that, and I don't think we have. Lisa Marie? No?
Other jurisdictions like the U.S. and the police stations is.
Yeah.
We did look at other jurisdictions, and I'm going to give the caveat again that we've all given that this is a different country and with a different structure constitutionally and charter. But the Foreign Registry, Foreign Interference Registry, has, in other countries, in their systems, has offered opportunities for law enforcement to take actions when someone should have and or didn't comply with the Foreign Registry requirements. And an example in the U.S. was the steps to shut down the PCR police stations, community police stations. So that's a very good example. And the RCMP is doing their work with respect to that, but in a different context because we don't have that registry. So in terms of evidence and approaches and potential sanctions and enforcement, it can be of help. But basically, yes, it is a compliance-based approach, like our lobbyist registry.
Thank you. I'll defer my time.
Senator Carignan.
Senator Carignan, followed by Senator Cardozo and Senator Dean. Thank you, Chair. Let's continue with the question asked by Senator Patterson. And I'm seeking clarification. I'm a member of the Conflict of Interest Committee. Our ethics code already provides for that. We don't need to amend it to say you can't contribute to espionage. We have clauses in the ethics code which are broad enough to cover such offenses and be able to penalize a senator who violates the code. The problem right now is that we don't have the names. We don't have the name for the ethics officer. So how can we penalize repressive behavior? We are told party leaders, if they had their names, may refrain from signing their candidacy letters and let them leave discreetly. You can't do that to the senator. He can sit till he's 75. That's why we have an ethics code that allows us to penalize. So what I'm proposing is that we must publish the names or forward the names, find a way of sending the names to the ethics officer for appropriate investigations to be conducted for any senators who are suspected of having committed an offense. Secondly, I'm surprised by the answer you gave my colleague, Senator Hosakos. You did not talk about any improvements we could make to the system. When we read your report, You say, well, it's not the Prime Minister who did the write-off. That concerns me because the Act says it's the Prime Minister who should do that. If it's someone else who signed off, then there's a problem. Let's say it's the Prime Minister who did that. There are all types of conditions there where we see that for political reasons, some information was not relayed to the Prime Minister's office. You are criticizing some behaviors like omissions, slow action by the Prime Minister's office. So you have clearly made your criticisms clear. So it's okay. But you are not proposing any changes to remove those powers from the Prime Minister. Those powers should come back to you, so you are able to carry out that assessment. I'm surprised that you are not going further with your recommendations on the structure to limit the Prime Minister's powers and the powers of the minister, because you have clearly said in paragraph 160, high-level officials have sometimes asked intelligence officials to withdraw reports that were published because they felt that the information was too politically sensitive. It's not a matter of national security. It's a political matter. It has no place. I'm looking at the list of countries that you noted. There's one with 3 asterisks. I would like to know what country that is. For the public interest, we need to have the name of that country. Is it Iran? Iran is okay. India is okay. But which country has 3 asterisks? What country? I don't understand why that country has not been named. The Prime Minister felt that it wasn't necessary to indicate the country. Why? Well, before I give the floor to Mr. Ralph, let me be clear. The redacting process is not done by the Prime Minister. And let me assure you, on the contrary, there were times during the meetings that I had to discuss with the Prime Minister before the report be deposited or submitted. There were times when the Prime Minister had to intervene to be asked to name countries or to ask for transparency. So it's not the Prime Minister's office that redacts documents. Article 21.5 of the Act says that the Prime Minister may do so, but the responsibilities are delegated to the officials in the Office of the Prime Minister, those in Justice Canada, and so on. We work very closely with all the stakeholders. So I just want to be clear on the matter of redacted documents. On the other matters or questions you asked, I'll give the floor to Mr. Ruff.
Build a little bit on what Mr. McGuinty said, that, and I'm 100% in agreement, the Prime Minister is not redacting anything. It's the process that we go through that allows those redactions to occur to protect for national security, national defense, and mainly international relationships if you want to talk countries. The criticism that you're rightfully pointed out, that the committee has pointed out in its report about lack of information getting to the Prime Minister, that's not lack of our report getting to him. That's lack of intelligence and previous reporting that the intelligence community has provided, and rightfully so, and that's why we flagged it. So there's been nothing redacted from this report that was redacted for political purposes. It's redacted for legitimate national security or foreign relations or national defense reasons. To get to your question about why we don't what's the solution going forward, it really wasn't our mandate. And there's lots of opportunity. That's what I think Parliament needs to be seized with. And it's something that, if you expect this committee to take a greater role, we mentioned this committee's review was supposed to start a few years ago. That 5-year review, if Parliament thinks this committee can play a role or a different function needs to be done, and that's why recommendation, I think, 2 talks about as well that the government should be involved in that process, talking to the political parties about how do we tackle this issue of dealing with things that maybe aren't of a complete criminal nature, but is something that needs to be addressed. And maybe that's a different organization or body, and as we've suggested in our report, you know, you can look at the different,
Je ne veux pas argumenter avec vous, M. Ruff, parce qu'on
I don't want to argue with you, Mr. Ruff. We are not in caucus. If we were in a caucus, I'll be arguing with you. But that's not the case. The committee's mandate is to review the legislative and regulatory framework. So if there's something that's not working, then we need to find out what should work. It's your duty to look into that.
Sénateur Dean et de la sénatrice Dasco.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
Very much for being here to talk about your report, and thank you for the work you do. It is always encouraging and enlightening to see when there's a situation where people across party lines work together, especially for the sake of national security. My question is quite simply on your first recommendation on the registry. A lot of people, a lot of communities have asked for this for a long time. And I want to ask you whether you think it is, whether we might not be expecting too much of it, only in this sense that bad actors who are here to do nefarious things are not going to be anxious to be signing up and be on the registry. How do we get the best out of the registry despite that?
I don't think the committee is suggesting, and I don't think you are either, Senator, that the registry is the panacea.
Right.
It's not the answer to all these things. It's something in the arsenal of responses available to this nation state called Canada. We think that there are a few helpful things that will flow from the registry. The first being that it will provide clarity with what is and what isn't foreign interference. I think if any of you were to sit down with colleagues from the Senate and ask them what the difference between foreign influence and foreign interference was, you'd be hard-pressed to get a clear answer. That's okay, because it's not part of our normal nomenclature. So we think that clarity would be helpful. It's also important because the registry will provide clarity with respect to what are our expectations around behavior and foreign interference. That's not set out anywhere for folks. And something that my good friend, the senator from the CLC, as I like to refer to him, thank you for your indulgence. We worked together for years, forgive
Senator
me.
Youssef.
Yeah, I know, I'm just kidding, Senator Youssef. Senator, you asked a question earlier about the sensitivity around our diasporic communities. We think that the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry has got to be carefully crafted to avoid the stigmatization of ethnocultural communities and to protect Canadian rights and freedoms. These are cherished rights and freedoms that are hard fought and won. And so we think it will go a considerable distance. And the beauty of this is, as our two colleagues on the other side of the room alluded to earlier, we're late to this dance, but that allows us to draw on the comparative experience from other jurisdictions and to perhaps design our way forward on this registry in a way that picks up on their learnings going forward.
Okay, thank you. I have other questions, but I know other members want to ask too.
You have time for another
No,
question?
say it's okay.
It's okay. Sénateur Dean, suivi.
Senator Dean, followed by Senator Dasco and Senator Delphine.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for another terrific report. This is, it's honest, it's transparent, and it's accessible. It's a really good read. And it's important, of course, that it has named and articulated transnational repression. And you also use the opportunity to name the major threat actors engaged in foreign interference currently. Alongside that, you note that over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm going to call it the league table has shifted a bit, and some people have moved up and some people have moved down, and there's a little bit of a surprise there. The question for you now is that some witnesses have suggested to us today that the government should follow up on that and actually name the major threat actors in the legislation. We know that a lot can change in 5 years, and it already has in a couple of years, and it seems to me that the government or security agencies could regularly communicate publicly who the main actors are without embedding that in legislation that will be rigidly in place for the next 5 years. Do you have a view on that?
No, we don't.
The committee doesn't.
The committee doesn't have a view on that. We haven't examined the question of the immutability of naming or not naming foreign state actors. We reflected what we saw in the review period in terms of kind of a hierarchy of involvement in the practice of foreign interference. Can that change? Yeah, it'll change. It's changed in the past. It'll change in the future. I think we can be pretty sure of that. The geopolitics of the world will change. I'm not sure if we can add much, Senator, to that. I don't know whether naming states would be a solution to this. I think it might be rapidly outdated. What do you think, Senator?
I think it might be rapidly outdated, so I think the right caution, you could consider another mechanism, and parliamentarians, we should consider another mechanism. I would just refer back to the question, I think it was Senator Carignan, but the names of state actors that have been redacted. There are reasons for those redactions. You can pick which one you want under the one set out in the criteria in the legislation, and that will remain a challenge for governments, even if there is another process of issuing a list. So it is the right question, and one of the things that Parliament, both chambers, need to be seized with and to consider what's the best way to provide Canadians with an update of this information.
Thank you.
Merci, Senator Dean. Senatrice.
Thank you, Senator Dean, Senator Dasco, followed by Senator Dalphond and Senator Hu.
Thank you, Chair. Thankfully, most of my questions have been answered. Speaking about rapidly outdated threat actors, there is an American election coming up. So anyway, I won't go there. Mr. McGuinty, earlier you stressed the importance of I would call them winnable ridings, ridings that a party has that are very safe for them. And you mentioned the fact that foreign interference has tended to be found in these kinds of ridings. So and yet in the end, so some of the provisions, some of the recommendations from your report have found their way into the bill. But at the same time, the monitoring of nominations has not. Is this, so I'd like your thoughts on this, because doesn't this actually say that the importance, that the fact that it's important and yet it hasn't made its way into the legislation? Is this a real problem for our system going forward? We are going to be having an election a year and a half from now, and if we're looking at a whole process that is not actually covered, and other processes too, leadership races are not included in the legislation, and there's a number of aspects of the political process that your report does mention that has not made its way into the legislation. So I'd just like your thoughts on that, and if this is going to create a real deficit of security and foreign interference continuing.
I'm going to jump in and say two things quickly. The legislation does include a provision which talks about influencing political parties and government. So there is a provision there. The specifics with respect to nomination and leadership races is really important. Our recommendation was not that they included in the bill, was that they engaged the political parties in determining this. No, I think the House of Commons, at the very least, if not right across Canadian society, would explode to think that one government of one political stripe imposes a system on all the political parties without the right kind of consultation coming together. There is a role for parliamentarians and political operatives, of the best sense of that word, to take responsibility for the processes that have been identified through intelligence, but specifically here today by this committee, as wanting in terms of the need for protection. And the political parties have got to come to an agreement around that. It's not going to be imposed by a parliamentary committee or by a government alone.
Are you saying they should do the monitoring themselves?
No, I'm saying they need to determine. Our recommendation, very specifically, let me just read it. It is the second recommendation, and I won't get to that page. There it is. The government engage political parties to determine whether party nomination processes and leadership conventions be included within the framework of the Canada Elections Act. We say here's one possibility, but you've got to determine whether that's the appropriate way to go, and all the parties have got to be engaged and come to an agreement on that. And I would say if people want to put action quickly, given what you're saying about this is imminent, then the parties should be coming together as we speak and getting this piece of work done. And if there is an agreement on what the legislation should look like, if it's the Canada Elections Act, then that could be brought forward in the fall and could be acted on quickly.
Well, in any case, I'm very skeptical that the parties would actually want to have this monitoring done by the chief electoral officer, but that's my take on it in any case.
If I could, Mr. Chair, one of the encouraging things in C70 is, I think, Clause 53 provides for an offense of influencing political or governmental process. And included in the definition of political or governmental process is the nomination of a candidate.
Oh.
So it goes some distance already, and perhaps it can be expanded and built upon in terms of some of the recommendations we've made.
Thank you.
Sénateur Dalphond, suivi du sénateur.
Senator Dalphond, then Senator Hu. Thank you, Chair.
Question will be exactly on Section 53 of the bill, so good introduction. So this was amended to add the word intimidations, and we hear from witnesses that came before you today about this transnational repressions and all these people that live in community here are subject to coercions, threats, and especially those that still have relatives in other countries. So you think that this Section 53 addresses the issue properly? Because some witnesses have suggested we also add discrimination on top of intimidation. And my second question is, even if we are having the perfect wording, isn't it the problem is the enforcement? And which I guess means that the police force, regional police, provincial police, and crown attorney, and all these people involved in the investigations, and then after that on charging, has to be fully aware of the have to be fully brief about what is transnational threats. And I think that's there that maybe CISIS can and share some information, not necessarily exact informations that lead to the find the traces, but to explain how it works, the schemes, everything else. Because I just look at domestic violence, and it took about 20 years for the police officers to understand what it meant and then to act. So maybe CISIS should be involved also in that, in training police forces about that. I don't know what to think of that.
That's a series of important questions, Senator, not many of which we've addressed in the review. The review speaks for itself, really, in terms of what we said around nomination processes and leadership conventions. We did highlight two case studies. One was the Han Dong case study, and the other was the question of foreign interference in two Conservative Party of Canada leadership races. And we've gone exactly as far as we can in terms of informing you and Canadians about what might have taken place. As I mentioned earlier, Canada does not criminalize interfering in nominations or other political party processes. This new C70 will go some distance. So we are hoping that through this C70 process, or perhaps beyond, we're going to simply reduce vulnerabilities. Because we came face to face with the troubling intelligence suggests that nomination processes and leadership races are particularly vulnerable to foreign interference. They are outside the ambit of federal regulation or oversight, and it may very well be time for an adult conversation about how we can make them tighter, so that Canadians can have more trust, more confidence in the process. But I wish I could give you more insight to the questions you've raised, and I don't think we're able to do that right now in terms of what we've looked at.
One thing to add.
Please.
Thank you. Just to add, you were also speaking about, I think witnesses